And welcome back. Time for our Capital Report with CapitolBeatOK.com's Pat McGuigan. And Pat, let's talk tax cuts. Remains in the news, and we see the economy is continuing to grow. According to the Office of State Finance, our revenues continue to surge. Still, there's this reluctance at the Capitol to do any kind of meaningful income tax cut. Is it just impossible to cut state spending enough to be able to do a cut or a phase out?
Yeah, the focus is on spending issues because they didn't do the exemption reforms and tax credits. The Senate released a plan this week that was mild, I would say, that would make a reduction to 5% and do some trade-offs with some very popular middle class and working class tax credits. So I don't think that's what's going to be the final legislation. There seems to be a view that cutting spending would just create horrific problems for the state, and there certainly doesn't appear to be, certainly in the Senate, the will to do a bunch of substantial spending cuts. So I had a little bit of fun this past week. I spent quite a bit of time on the phone and through the email and in person with Jonathan Small, who's the fiscal analyst at OCPA, and we came up with his distilled top 10 ways to cut spending. Now, he had originally proposed as much as $850 million. The legislative House members had put forward cuts that could amount to as much as $500 million. Going through and just picking out the top 10, we came up with $190 million. And it was a very interesting discussion, but very quickly I'll just summarize them. There's a state employee health insurance reform plan that actually did pass in 2010 and was vetoed by Governor Henry. They were unable to override the veto, but that alone is worth like $47 million, I believe. It's worth a lot. $75 million, I'm sorry, by the time it would be implemented. Another possible reform would be to contract with the private sector to do a lot of functions that the state now does. Now, it's not stop doing them, but have them done by the private sector, $49 million. There's several others. Telecommunications efficiency, further efficiencies building on what they've already done, ending payments to the National Conference of State Legislatures, which is kind of a popular theme with conservatives because the NCSL is the relatively more liberal of the state legislative groups. No more funding for the Space Travel Authority. Rodeos, roping contests, festivals, golf courses, leave those to the localities. You add all of this up, it's $190 million. And it's not that there's a lack of ideas on how to trim state spending. There's a lack of will to do it in good times. The sentiment is let's backfill on everything or a good deal of what's been cut rather than do additional right-sizing or trimming of government. So that's the status going into the last week of the session.
All right, let's talk about the will to make changes at DHS. Republicans in the legislature have detailed bills, including a constitutional amendment to transform the management of DHS. Is this a done deal?
I don't know if it's a done deal. I think we probably now have the parameters of the legislative or constitutional changes that will be made to make DHS better, more efficient. The first thing to understand is that the price tag they've been projecting, which is $25 to $31 million in the first fiscal year, is still doable in the view of the reformers, and that appears to be getting a good reaction all across the spectrum. It's called the Pinnacle Plan, and the implementation of it does require some pretty substantial changes at DHS. Vertical integration, you know, some of the employees say that there's 8 people between them and the commissioner. And this would trim that to about 3 or 4. And that's an interesting, so there's going to be some middle management that might actually disappear. Those resources, in addition to the new money, then be put down into the ranks for delivery of services. The big ticket, before I run out of time, is a constitutional amendment that would abolish a freestanding commission for DHS, put it under the governor's appointment authority. DHS was designed in the 1930s at the height of the Great Depression, and it's been at times paralyzed in its reaction to problems and challenges. One other thing before we go is that it's makes clear, the new legislation would make clear that disclosure would be the assumption for guys like us, people in the press, and for citizens wanting information about deaths or things that go wrong in the system. That's important because the feds have put out some guidelines that were kind of confusing. I think that's going to be worked out. So that's a summary of where things stand at DHS.
Very good. And you can read more about these and other topics at CapitolBeatOK.com. For Pat McGuigan, I'm Alex Cameron. Have a great Saturday.